Hi there, my name is Debbie, and thank you so much for watching, or actually just for listening, because I'm going to be reading you the Go Giver book, and we're on chapter 3. So you don't even need to be watching. You can just, putz around in the yard, the kitchen, drive, however you want, but just listen. That's all you got to do. So I'm going to read to you. We were on chapter 3. Which is going to be the law of value, because there's several laws, and we learned last week it was about the secret to his success was giving, but it's a lot more than that. So this is the Go Giver. It's a little story about a powerful business idea. Bob Burg and John David Mann, that's who it's by. Now here we go, and just listen. So the law of value. Just before noon that Monday, Joe arrived at the Great Stone Mansion, eager to see what lay in store. All he knew was that he would be meeting with Pindor, a friend of his, a real estate magnate who had agreed to talk with Joe about the first law of stratospheric success. Joe still wondered about this whole giving business and whether or not this trade secret contained anything that would really work for him. But it's sure working for Pindor, he mused as he drove up the broad tree-lined drive. And it wasn't just the man's resume and magnificent property. The guy radiates success, he thought. It's not just money, it's something far more powerful than money. He thought about nothing else all weekend and still couldn't quite identify what that something was. Pindor stood waiting for him as he rounded the circular drive and pulled up to the stone steps. Before Joe could cut the engine, Pindor opened the passenger's door and hopped in. "Okay if we take your car? Don't want to be late for our meeting." Joe felt a stab of disappointment. He wasn't going to get any of Rachel's famous coffee after all. "Here," said Pindor as he buckled himself into his seat and handed over a giant mug of steaming hot coffee. "You can enjoy this along the way." 20 minutes later, they arrived downtown and parked at Lafrite's Italian-American Cafe. Obviously much more than a cafe, the full-service restaurant was jammed with a line forming out the door. On their way into the building, someone pushed Gruffy past them, complaining about how crowded it was, and bumped into Pindor. Much to Joe's surprise, Pindor simply smiled at him. The moment they were inside the door, the maitre d' came over and escorted the two of them to a corner table. Of course, thought Joe, Pindor must be a VIP here. "Thank you, Sal," said Pindor. Sal bowed to Pindor and winked at Joe. It struck Joe that Pindor was exceedingly gracious to everyone they encountered, and as they took their seats, Joe asked Pindor about that. "It never hurts to be kind to people," Pindor replied. "Once when I was a young man, I was walking to a young lady's home to meet her for our very first date. I was nervous. As I turned onto her street, an older man walked right into me, banging his head into mine and tromping on my foot. He was embarrassed that he hadn't been watching where he was going and mortified that he might have injured me. No harm done, I assured him. I've been told I have a hard head. I hope you didn't hurt yourself." He laughed with surprise. I wished him a wonderful day and hurried on to meet my young lady friend. About 15 minutes after I'd arrived at the girl's home, I heard the front door open. "Daddy," she called out, "I want you to meet my date." Pindor stopped and glanced at Joe as if expecting him to finish the story. Joe did. "And let me guess, it was the man who had smacked into you." "It was," agreed Pindor. Back from a quick trip to the store, he complimented his daughter on her good judgment and told her I was a thoughtful, polite young man. So you could say your relationship got off on the right foot, observed Joe. Pinder laughed. Indeed it did. Stayed that way too. That beautiful young lady has been my wife for nearly 50 years. Ernesto, he called out to one of his cooks who was headed their way. And then he's speaking in Italian. Pinder exclaimed. The portly fellow beamed, hunkered down with them at the table. You gonna introduce me to your new friend? Ernesto's voice bore traces of crisp northern Italian accent. Ernesto, this is Joe. Joe, Ernesto. A young waiter approached with a pair of menus, but before Joe and Pinder could say a word, Ernesto turned to the young man and fired off a soft stream of Italian phrases. The waiter whooshed silently away again. Ernesto, said Pinder, tell my young friend how you got started here. Ernesto looked at Joe and said, hot dogs. Joe blinked. Hot dogs? I came here, Ernesto went on. Must be more than 20 years ago. Now a foolish young man. I had just enough money saved to buy a hot dog cart and the license to run it. Actually, come to think of it, the license cost me more than the cart. Pinder chuckled, and Joe had the distinct sense that his host had heard this story many times before. It was hard at first, Ernesto was saying, but I had some loyal customers, and word got around after a few years. My little cart got written up in the city's annual Best of Guide. The chef paused to glance back toward the grill. Wow, really, said Joe? Best hot dog stand in the city? That's great. Pinder smiled and gently corrected him. Best outdoor dining experience in the city. Ernesto held up both hands modestly and shrugged. They were kind to me. But Joe stammered, and did you do that? I mean, no offense, but how does a hot dog stand manage to outrank the swanky sidewalk cafes in this neighborhood? Ernesto gave another theatrical shrug, his eyebrows and his shoulders moving together like a Marriott, saying, who knows? He winked at Pinder. Lucky? He glanced back at the grill again and said Italian words, and he stood up and strode away. Quite a character, Joe noted aloud as they watched Ernesto disappear through a door to the kitchen. Pinder nodded. Indeed he is. Actually, Ernesto is the head chef here. Really? Said Joe. Really, Pinder replied. In fact, he owns the place. Really? Said Joe was intrigued. Their waiter placed their food before them, and Pinder thanked him. He took his first bite of eggplant parmigiana, closed his eyes, and groaned with pleasure. The man is an artist. It's delicious, Joe agreed, as he dove into the magnificent meal. He thought of how Susan would love this place. The two men ate in silence for nearly a minute before Pinder spoke again. In fact, he owns a half dozen restaurants now. Also, several $100 million worth of commercial real estate, all starting with a hot dog stand. Joe dropped his silverware and stared at Pinder, who continued savoring his lunch. He's the guy we came here to meet? The real estate magnate is him? Ernesto was headed back towards their table as Pinder whispered to Joe, a very useful thing to remember. Appearances can be deceiving. He slid over to make room for the chef. Truth is, they nearly always are. Ernesto slipped into the booth next to Pinder over next 5 minutes. He and Pinder gave Joe a quick history of his career. Young Ernesto's Infrat's reputation had grown until he was discovered by several business executives who abandoned their local high-class establishments to have their power lunches at the little sidewalk hot dog stand. Although Ernesto rarely talked about himself, one of these regulars, a man whom Ernesto called simply the connector, Joe made a mental note to ask Pindar later about this mysterious sounding character, eventually learned of his background as a chef. Impressed with the young man's sharp business mind and exceptional devotion to service, a few of these executives pulled together an investment group and backed him with the finances to open his own restaurant. And within a few years, Pindar interjected, his little cafe did so well that he bought us out, earning us all a tidy profit in the process. And he hadn't stopped there. After establishing a group of area restaurants, Ernesto began investing some of his profits in the properties adjoining his restaurants. Over the years, he became one of the largest commercial real estate owners in the city. As he listened, Joe realized there was another layer to Ernesto that he hadn't seen at first. Underneath that jovial, bigger-than-life Italian chef persona, there was a powerful sense of focus and intention. Once Joe became aware of it, it was riveting. He began to see why the little group of executives had invested in the man's future. Joe understood that Pindar had emphasized the word experience for a reason. It was not the hot dogs, but the person serving the hot dogs that had vaulted the young man to such popularity. Not the dining experience. Ernesto had made buying a hot dog into an unforgettable event, especially for children, Pindar pointed out. I've always been good at remembering kids' names, Ernesto explained, and remembering their birthdays, continued Pindar, and their favorite colors, and their favorite cartoon heroes, and their best friends' names. He glanced at Joe and gave the next word emphasis, et cetera, again, Italian word. Ernesto gave another trademark shrug. What can I say? I like kids. Children started dragging their parents to the little hot dog stand. Soon the parents were dragging their friends there too. It turned out that Ernesto was just as gifted as remembering adults' interest as he was with kids. Everyone likes to be appreciated, said Ernesto. And that's the golden rule of business, added Pindar, all things being equal. Ernesto finished the phrase, people will do business with and refer business to those people they know, like, and trust. He turned to look at Joe. Tell me, what distinguishes a good restaurant from a great restaurant? Why do some restaurants do well, while a few, like this one, do stratospherically well? Obviously, better food, replied Joe with hesitation. Ernesto's delighted laughter filled the booth. Several heads turned and waves of smiles rolled through the dining room like ripples on a pond. Ah, he said, mille grazie, signor, Italian, which I don't speak. Sorry. You are a man of good taste, but I have to admit, while our food is very good, there are half a dozen other places within 3 blocks with food just as wonderful as ours. Still, even on their best nights, they're lucky to have half a clientele that comes here. Why is that, do you think? Joe had no answer. A bad restaurant, Ernesto went on, tries to give just enough food and service, both in quantity and quality, to justify the money it takes from the customer. A good restaurant strives to give the most quantity and quality for the money it takes. But a great restaurant strives to defy imagination. Its goal is to provide a higher quality of food and service than any amount of money could possibly pay for. He looked at Pinder, then back to Joe. Did the old man tell you he would show you his 5 laws? Joe nodded eagerly. He was about to learn the first law of stratospheric success. Ernesto looked again at Pinder. Should I tell him? Please, replied Pinder. Ernesto leaned in and spoke in a conspiratorial whisper. Your true worth is determined by how much more you give in value than you take in payment. Joe wasn't sure how to respond. Giving away more value than you get paid for? That was their big secret. I'm sorry, I don't get it, Joe confessed. I mean, I appreciate where you're coming from, and your story is obviously, well, it's amazing. But honestly, that sounds like a recipe for bankruptcy. It's almost like you're trying to avoid making money. Not at all, Ernesto waggled his one finger. Does it make money? It is not a bad question. It's a great question. It's just a bad first question. It starts you off pointed in the wrong direction. He let Joe ponder that for a moment, then continue. The first question should be, does it serve? Does it add value to others? If the answer to that question is yes, then you can go ahead and ask, does it make money? In other words, said Joe, exceed people's expectations and they'll pay you even more. That's one way to look at it, replied Ernesto, but the point isn't to have them pay you more. It's to give them more. You give, give, give. Why? Another shrug. Because you love to. It's not a strategy. It's a way of life. And when you do, he added with a big grin, then very, very profitable things began to happen. Wait, said Joe. So profitable things began to happen, but I thought you said you're not thinking about the results. That's right, Ernesto agreed. You're not. But that doesn't mean they won't happen. And they certainly will, added Pinder. All of the great fortunes in the world have been created by men and women who had a greater passion for what they were giving, their product, service, or idea, than for what they were getting. And many of those great fortunes have been squandered by others who have had greater passion for what they were getting than what they were giving. Joe grappled with everything he'd heard. It seemed to make sense, at least when these two characters were saying it, but as far as he could see, it just didn't square with his experience. I have a hard time seeing how. Ah, said Pinder, holding up his index finger and cutting Joe off in mid-sentence. Joe blanched. What? Ernesto grinned. He leaned in toward Joe and said, did he tell you about his, condition? Joe looked puzzled for a moment. Then he understood. Oh, right, the condition. Pinder smiled. It's not about seeing, it's about doing. Joe sighed. Right, he repeated. I need to find some way to apply it. He looked at both men, then added, or I'll turn into a pumpkin. The two men chuffed with glee, and Joe felt his face relax into a grin, too. For the moment, he had forgotten all about his secret quest for clout and leverage. Pinder was already on his feet. We should go. This young man needs to get back to work. Who are you seeing tomorrow? Ernesto asked Joe. Joe looked at Pinder. Tomorrow, a bona fide genius, replied Pinder. The CEO. Ah, said Ernesto, nodding. The CEO. Very good, very good. Keep your ears open, young man. The CEO. Joe tried to imagine who this person might be. All right, the first law, the law of value. And this was it. Your true worth is determined by how much more you give in value than you take in payment.